Welcome back, everyone, for what's the final session of the day. And again, welcome to anyone who's just joining us online. I'm excited to welcome our final speaker of the day, which is our guest speaker, futurist Matthew Griffin, for what I think should be an interesting and intriguing session, certainly very different to the first two technical pension sessions that we've had today. I think Matthew's got a pretty packed session planned for us, but we should have time for a few questions. So if you do have any questions for Matthew, please do, again, submit them via Slido, and then I'll ask them at the end. But Matthew is an award-winning futurist. He's a strategic advisor and author of the Codex of the Future series. He worked previously at IBM, Atos and Dell, but after that he founded the 311 Institute, which is a global futures and deep futures consultancy, which is working across the next 50 years, which, you know, even for an actuary, that's a pretty long time horizon that he's looking at. And he's also founder and CEO of the World Futures Forum and the Exponential University, which are both philanthropic organisations whose mission it is to reduce global inequality and ensure that the benefits of the future are accessible to everyone. So with that, please welcome Matthew to the stage.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so I must admit, I do tend to think that when you have a look across industry, so I work across industries, I work across technologies and trends and all kinds of different things. Yeah, the pensions industry and I actually have a lot in common. Same with the education industry, because ultimately what we're trying to do is we are trying to ultimately prepare people for the future. However, you know, outside of traditional, the future that traditional multinationals look at, we're looking at huge timelines. Yeah. If you think that the typical multinational will sort of look at, say, 5 to 10 years out, unless you're China, where they actually look 50 years out, you know, as a sort of as a cultural sort of point of difference. Yeah, trying to look just 2 or 3 years out in today's turbulent times is difficult enough. There's a huge amount of change, there's a huge amount of risk, there's a huge amount of disruption, and I'm going to show you some things that I hope you don't know, that you haven't actually seen before. And what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be ostensibly talking about two topics: the future of work and the future of longevity. So the future of work will be where you work, how you work, the things that you do. And longevity, I will show you the technologies and the innovations that will help you live longer, period. So when we have a look at the future of longevity, for example, we are increasingly reaching the point basically where 100 is the new 60. And I will show you the science fiction-like things that are actually happening across a whole variety of different industries, not just the healthcare industry, to make that a reality. And then if you want to go and have a look at some of these things, if you don't think they exist, I can put you in touch with the people who are doing them. So when we have a look at industries in general, there is not a single industry on the planet today that isn't being disrupted from the inside out. We're not just talking about kind of iterative disruption. We are talking about complete, what we call jumping the S-curve disruption. Moving completely from one way of doing things to a completely new way of doing things. Now, for example, if we take agriculture, today we have around 2 billion people on the planet who are hungry. We have 821 million people on the planet who literally are lucky if they eat in any given day. However, today, basically, we can grow vegetables and crops in vertical farms and in buildings like these. We can have 8 times the yield. We can use 100% less potable water because we extract water from the air, 100% less pesticides and chemicals. All the crops are organic. They are guaranteed. They aren't subject to being eradicated by climate change or pests and so on and so forth. But you can grow 8 times the yield in 350 times less the footprint of a traditional farm. From a meat perspective, we always keep getting told that we have to eat insects in the future for protein. However, we can take a cell from an animal, put it into something called a bioreactor, and we can create, and have created, and are selling, and people are consuming in both the US and Singapore, chicken nuggets, beef burgers, duck, fish, salmon, and so on and so forth. So increasingly, we're able to do what happens inside an animal, outside an animal, to fundamentally change agriculture. And these are multi-trillion-dollar changes. When we have a look at the energy industry, we're moving from fossil fuels. So a lot of pension funds are obviously coming out of fossil fuels. I was sitting with people who had about $4 trillion worth under asset basically yesterday in London. And we're moving to renewable. Now, this particular switch, it's estimated that to get to net zero by 2050 will cost over $92 trillion. Today, we're spending about $2 trillion basically on the energy transition. We need to ramp that by another $2 trillion to actually hit the net zero target in 2050. When we have a look at finance and financial services, we see the increasing use of artificial intelligence, quantum computing, particularly as it relates to matrix calculations. We're starting to see the development of robo-advisors, but increasingly we're also seeing not just traditional banking and wealth funds being disrupted by sort of fintechs and so on and so forth, but also being disrupted by decentralized finance. Now, when you have a look at decentralized finance, for example, this is where Roblox, Minecraft, Fortnite could actually be a future financial services company, and increasingly is. Now, from a pensions perspective, in Virginia, there is now a fund that looks like they're about to get the green light to invest in decentralized finance initiatives, which will be a first. So these are things like Web3, crypto, and everything else. This is literally Wild West. When we have a look at the economies, basically, that fund managers are actually investing in increasingly, there are three types of economy. So we have the physical economy, the digital economy, but also the virtual economy. When we have a look at the virtual economy, for example, things like the metaverse, it's estimated that that economy is worth anywhere between $8 to $13 trillion. So when we start talking about where we actually put our fund money, do we actually put it in virtual assets, virtual products, or physical products? So these are the questions that a lot of the investors that I work with are actually asking. When we have a look at healthcare, I'll go into that in a little bit more detail, but when we have a look at healthcare, science fiction is science fact, and I'll show you why later. And then when we have a look at transportation, the entire transportation industry is being ripped in two. So increasingly, every single vehicle, whether it is a car or a 500,000-ton cargo ship, is going fully autonomous, and then generally they are going electric or using alternative fuels. So as I say, there is not a single industry on the planet that is not going through systemic disruption. Now, these are the technologies that are responsible, basically, for some of these disruptions. So this is a starburst. I track over 650 exponential technologies. There are 180 on here. Just one technology on this wheel has the potential to either disrupt one industry or every industry. Artificial intelligence, for example, is one dot. Now, when we talk about building next generation products and services, whether those are physical products, digital products, or whether they're virtual products, this wheel, which spans the next 50 years, where these individual dots represent when a particular technology is estimated to be mature enough for people to combine together to create the next generation smartphone, or whatever it happens to be. When you start combining these together, you change every single part of human culture, business, and society, irrevocably. So, for example, when we have a look at advanced manufacturing, we have 3D printing. So 3D printing disrupts the $10 trillion manufacturing industry. It also lets us do some very interesting things in healthcare. When we have a look at bioreactors as an individual technology, bioreactors solve global famine at local scale. When we start having a look at things like biotech, there are huge numbers of changes coming through in biotech. When we look at compute, when we talk about risk calculations and so on and so forth, quantum computers can do calculations that would take a normal giant supercomputer, like the one at the US Department of Energy, the Summit supercomputer, 3.5 billion years, but it can do it in minutes. We've already proven these. So when we have a look at things like optimization calculations, which your industry basically is quite heavily reliant on, quantum computers fundamentally change the game. And then when we have a look at things like connectivity, we've got 5G coming through, 6G coming through, we have low Earth orbit satellite systems coming through that ultimately connect every single thing and every single person on the planet to one another. Electronics, energy, massive energy shifts. When we have a look at artificial intelligence, by 2035, we should have artificial general intelligence. Artificial general intelligence is a kind of artificial intelligence that is able to learn like a human, but is also able to do more than one thing really, really well. So today, most artificial intelligences are fairly narrow. They're really good at doing one thing. But when you ask them to do something else, they have no idea. So artificial general intelligence, for example, as it starts rolling out from about 2035 to 2045, fundamentally changes the workforce, irrevocably. So when we start talking about these longer time spans, quite a lot of the technologies that are actually in here will be commercializing in the next 10, 20, 30 years, and many already are. And we sort of go around this wheel and everything else. But when you have a look at the scale and the scope of change, it is monumental. Now, from a risk perspective, when we're having a look at the value of particular investments and we're trying to figure out what is the value of that investment over the next 5, 10, 20, 30 years, we have robo-hackers already here. This is the weaponization of artificial intelligence. Robo-hackers can hack your systems 100 million times faster than even the best human hackers. So when we have a look at cyber, the potential to destroy company value increases exponentially in the future. Serious organized crime groups 4 years ago were making about $600 billion from cybercrime. The latest estimates put that at $1.2 trillion. And these figures kind of come from European tax organizations that are trying to unbundle a lot of these dark financing things. When we have a look at climate change, I have multiple clients. One of you thinks, well, actually, quite a number of you are actually in the room. Well, when we have a look at things like property portfolios, they have multi-billion-dollar property portfolios. Now, traditionally, we would expect the value of these property portfolios to increase over time, with some bumps. But a lot of this company's property portfolio is near the sea. And so increasingly, they are writing down the value of that property portfolio as they look over the longer term by up to 75%. They're also selling that property portfolio around the world and now moving inland. But in addition to that, when we start having a look at things like extreme weather, we talk about extreme weather today. We see extreme weather destroying around 40% of global crops, for example. That increases the informal economy, the impact on the informal economy, but it also has a significant impact, basically, on food security. In China, Japan, and in the United States, they are seeing more hurricanes that defy the Category 5 hurricane ranking. So they're now actually talking about, and they have been for the past year, talking about implementing a Category 6 hurricane ranking. So when we think that we are experiencing climate change today, and we have some bad weather around the world, and we have fires over here and floods over here, and so on and so forth, we haven't really seen anything yet. When we have a look at sea level rise, 54 of the world's megacities are literally next to the coast. So by 2040, it's estimated that 1 billion people will be forced to leave those cities. When you have a look at Jakarta, Jakarta has about 12 million people. It's flooding and sinking at the same time. So the government there is now moving their capital city 100 miles inland. What does that do to a portfolio, whatever that portfolio is? When we have a look at things like cybersecurity again, by 2025, we will have a big quantum computer, 1,000 qubit quantum computer. We'll be able to crack 256-bit encryption in a couple of minutes. Bear in mind, that actually takes about 3 billion years with a brute force attack using a traditional supercomputer today. But it's also estimated, again, theoretical, but people have actually been trying to figure this out. It's also estimated that we can crack 4,096-bit encryption in 8 to 12 hours. So what happens to the value of the companies that you've invested in when all of a sudden their secrets are no longer secret? Then we have deepfakes. When we have a look at synthetic content, we are only just at the beginning of what synthetic content actually is going to be capable of. We have people that are manipulating content, creating deepfakes, with a little bit of hand-holding. But we also have artificial intelligence increasingly creating content from scratch, whether it's blogs, articles, reports, books, podcasts, all that kind of stuff. So when we actually have a look at the impact basically of deepfakes on companies' brands, reputation, all that kind of stuff, market value, it's quite terrifying. When we have a look at things like stock crashes, I can create a piece of deepfaked content that suggests that Joe Biden has moved the entire US 7th Pacific Fleet off the coast of North Korea. Now, bearing in mind that the vast majority of investors are tied into sentiment on social media platforms, those things like quantitative traders and so on and so forth, we've already seen an example basically where quantitative traders sent one company, Facebook, stock down by over $32 billion before it then corrected. Ronaldo moved a can of Coke from this side of his desk to the other side of the desk, then kind of swore and picked up water. That sent Coca-Cola's share price down by $4 billion, basically in the space of about 5 minutes. So what happens when you can't trust what you see? What happens when the big social networks can't identify that this piece of information is fake, or they don't take it down fast enough? Bearing in mind that Churchill said lies travel 10 times faster than the truth. Now, increasingly, what about Elon Musk being involved in the crypto scam?
What can you tell us about your project B and how it will help people get rich right now?
Today we are launching an investment project that is working right now. If you see this video, absolutely everyone can earn in it. Everything is very simple. You invest your money in Bitcoin for TeslaTreebot.net is our bot, after which everyone who invested their cryptocurrency will be able to receive exactly 30% of dividends every day from the invested amount.
How long will it take for dividends to arrive?
I'm sure that from 3 months.
Is the number of seats unlimited?
Yes, absolutely.
In 2 years' time, you'll not be able to tell that's a deep fake. And that's kind of the issue. What happens basically when you have a major influencer, a nano influencer, as companies like WPP and Dentsu suddenly appear saying, by the way, I think that Apple basically sucks as a company because Tim Cook did something or other, and here's a picture of Tim Cook kicking a kid. Right? So this is a whole area of hurt, which then means that the information that the investors you use need to be absolutely bulletproof, and they have a problem with that. And then when we actually have a look at the speed of change, organizations like ARK Invest, which run out of London, estimate that the impact of emerging technologies on value destruction will total over $50 trillion. So if you think about the amount of value that is held up already basically in a whole variety of different organizations, like oil and gas, the value of oil and gas stocks and their portfolio has been tanking for years. When we have a look at the automotive industry, they're moving from an old business model to a new business model where vehicles drive themselves. That's value destruction. So when we have a look at value destruction across the piece, it's estimated that we will see $50 trillion worth of value destroyed. However, it's also estimated that emerging technologies will increase and create up to $210 trillion worth of new value. And this is the struggle that a lot of fund managers actually have. They say, on the one hand, we're seeing huge amounts of value destruction in our portfolios. But on the other hand, we see huge amounts of opportunity to do new things in new ways and actually grow these businesses to scales basically that were unimaginable just 10 years ago. So all of a sudden, it's the who do we bet on? How do we transition our portfolio from this to this? Now, when we have a look at things like future of work, I typically tend to find that the vast majority of people actually leave out business models. And it might sound a little bit boring, but business models are the how and the why of how we employ people and how we deliver the fundamental services that we do. So, for example, when we have a look at some of the tests that we've seen in the UK, so the UK, there are now 3,200 people going through a 4-day week. Because when we talk about the future of work, we kind of assume as business leaders that I want you to work Monday to Friday. And then when we say, well, why? We go, because it's always been done that way. Now, there are an increasing number of voices that are saying you shouldn't measure how long a person is doing a job. Sounds fairly straightforward and simple. You should measure how productive they are and how efficient they are at doing that particular task or that job. Now, what we've actually found, basically we found this in Iceland and we found this in the Nordics as well. When you switch people to a 4-day week, they're actually 30% more productive. And so now we have a major experiment going on in the UK with about 65 different companies. Because have we been measuring productivity wrong? Should we actually change how we work and how often we work? Now, when we have a look at younger generations as well, 36% of millennials work in the gig economy. When I go and have conversations with younger generations, you know, they feel they are increasingly less likely to work full-time for a company. They will say, well, you know, because of the internet and everything else, I have the option to do this job in the morning, this job at lunchtime, and this job in the evening. So there are more and more younger generations, basically, that are increasingly getting used to the idea of they don't work for an employer full-time any longer. And actually, the last time I was with Allen and Overy, we were actually talking about this. We were talking about the future of work. So we went to an offsite. And when you have a look at one of their organizations, Peerpoint, that's it, so Peerpoint, Allen and Overy were trying to make Peerpoint more attractive for freelancers to come and work into. So you sort of come into Allen and Overy's Peerpoint, you dip into it, you know, you do the work basically that A&O basically have actually required you to do, and then you go off to another company to do something else. So this kind of actually plays into this sort of gig economy kind of vibe. Now, we also have the rise of algorithmic organizations. Now, what I mean by that is we have increasingly huge numbers of people that are not working for a human boss. So we have artificial intelligences that are hiring people. So 64% of the Fortune 250 now use artificial intelligence to identify candidates and then hire them and onboard them. And that's a conversation in itself. In Amazon and Uber's case, we have artificial intelligences that are now, and have been for a while, automatically assessing how well you are performing at your job. So for example, in Amazon, yeah, if you are expected to stack 60 boxes an hour, but you're only achieving 40 an hour, firstly, the artificial intelligence will say, well, have you tried improving your productivity? Have you tried lifting these boxes in a slightly different way? So AI is managing the employee, but also the health of the employee. But increasingly, if you don't hit those benchmarks, these AIs are automatically sending you your P45. And there was a huge court case in Europe with Amazon and Uber, because Uber is exactly the same thing. If, as a driver, you consistently get low ratings, you get fired by the artificial intelligence. And then we have artificial intelligence boards, especially out of Hong Kong. And these AI boards are essentially autonomous decision-making systems that decide the future of an organization. And then the human boards tick the box and go, yep, I accept that information. And then AI managers. There was a sort of Asian organization, a little bit along the lines of Fiverr, where 45,000 people on this gig economy platform didn't realize that they were being managed by an artificial intelligence. Then, when we have a look at Jack Dorsey is a Web 3.0 advocate. We increasingly have more companies talking about company as a protocol. So this is where I turn my company into a protocol, but also the concept of temporary organizations. So I can create an organization structurally that lasts for 1 year. And then at the end of that year, it dissolves itself, and then it just disperses the assets in whatever particular sequence and way basically that we've decided. Now, when we have a look at things like company as a protocol, things like decentralized autonomous organizations, this is where we fundamentally change the governance models. That's it, because everybody has a say in the running of the company, but also everyone has a say in the direction of the company. So we no longer really have the concept of hierarchical management. This is more horizontal management. And then we have about 15 of these in Hong Kong and Wall Street, as well as other places. We have fully autonomous companies. So in Hong Kong, we have IDA. IDA is a fully autonomous hedge fund. And the founders have said, when we die, the AI will just keep running. And it invests and everything else. Bridgewater Associates, they have $160 billion under management, 1,500 people. And the CEO basically wants to automate the entire company and has been hiring the ex-IBM Watson team to do it. We have fully autonomous communications and social media companies already coming through. So when we start talking about, whether it be from a fund perspective, a legal perspective, how do you start governing and managing and overseeing and doing due diligence on these kinds of organizations that really only exist in the ether, where you can't pick up the phone to anybody because there is nobody there? So, and these are all trends that are accelerating as well. Now, when we actually have a look at the future of work, work in the workplace, again, we have three sort of options of where we actually work. We can work in a physical location, we can work digitally, just the usual sort of kind of, I'm in front of a laptop thing, or we can work in the virtual environment. Now, when we have a look at surveys from the likes of Oxford University as well as McKinsey, the vast majority of surveys typically estimate that up to 50% of all of today's jobs will be automated or partially automated. However, and the media sort of seizes on this and says by 2030, half of the entire global workforce will be made redundant because artificial intelligence will have taken your job. But that's not what these surveys have actually said. And in fact, there's a difference in the different kinds of automation. So we have automated, which is just done. Standard robotic process automation. I have automated your expense approval process. You no longer need your manager to click yes to it if it's under £50, if it meets certain criteria, for example. There are loads of companies rolling out just standard robotic process automation. Then we have autonomous. Now, autonomous systems are fundamentally different. They take in information. They're typically artificial intelligence driven, but they take in information, and then using deep neural networks and everything else, they then start to figure out, well, if I have this set of information, what do I do with it? And what's the result? So these are increasingly decision-making systems. Fully autonomous vehicles make decisions to go that way rather than that way, to run that person over rather than that person. When we have a look at things like fully autonomous boards, this is decision-making. When we have a look at things like IBM Watson, for example, as well as other artificial intelligences, these are decision-making platforms. But we're increasingly seeing the rise of autonomous platforms. And then we have augmented. And again, the press never ever mentions what happens when you combine humans, the best of humans, with the best of artificial intelligence. And you get some quite surprising results that I'll come to. Now, from a work perspective, we can work from anywhere. We know this. We can work from the office. However, as a result of the pandemic, companies now sort of have an issue, because from a hiring perspective, they're expected to offer new hires flexible working conditions where you can come into the office only if you need to. But with companies like Adidas, PwC, and everything else, who used to have high cultural scores, what they're finding is, yes, people are coming into the office, but everyone's coming into the office at different times, which means the teams never get together, which then means that the culture of that organization takes a hit. So there's a lot of questions over, what do we do here? So for example, with PwC, they say, do we now say you have to be in the office 2 days a week all at the same time? In which case, we're not offering flexible working any longer, in which case means that we are less attractive as an employer. So we kind of have these sort of conundrums now coming through. And then, thanks to space satellites and all this sort of stuff, and space internet systems, you can work literally in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, because you can get 1.5 gig a second anywhere in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. So while people have always sort of said work from home, we've always been able to work from anywhere. You can take your laptop down the beach, you can take it on a canoe. But increasingly, not only can we work from anywhere, okay, I could work from this stage, you can work anywhere. Now, this is where we sort of get into the idea of things like telepresence. Now, I write a load of books and codexes and everything else, and just for a laugh, I wrote the trends one in virtual reality. And I was hanging in mid-space, basically while I was actually writing the book, and it was actually really weird, but it was also quite interesting. Now, when we start talking about virtual reality, we really do start getting into the world of weirdness, because organizations like Stanford have said, well, if we want to improve people's productivity, depending on the job that you're doing, why don't we give people a third arm? That sounds odd, But in Stanford's case, they literally had a third virtual arm coming out of people's chest. And when they asked people, how do you find it? People said, well, I found it really weird to actually figure out how to control this third arm, this third appendage. But once I did, I managed to actually get the hang of it, and increasingly productivity shot up by about 30%. So when we start talking about working in virtual reality, it's not just about sitting down at a desk working in virtual reality with a virtual reality headset on and all that kind of stuff. We can increasingly do odd things in virtual reality to improve productivity. You could have 20 screens if you wanted to. Basically, you could be working on a Waikiki beach, all that kind of stuff, while still sat on your sofa at home. So this is sort of, this kind of has an impact on mental health as well. Now, in addition to that, when we talk about working anywhere, if I'm a surgeon at Guy's and St. Tommy's, and I said to my wife, I'm going to be operating on a patient today. Now, traditionally, I'd have to go into the hospital, and the patient would be in front of me. But increasingly, because of 5G, teleoperations, robotics, and all other things, I could literally sit down there. I could have an augmented reality or virtual reality headset on. I could be operating on my patient, but my patient could actually be in Johannesburg in South Africa.
We had a young woman with an acute heart attack. The total transfer time to get her to our hospital was 3 hours. There's a feeling of helplessness as a physician that you know what the treatment is to limit their chance of death, but you can't get to them.
Our hypothesis is that if we implement remote robotics in its full capacity, we will change the lives for hundreds of thousands of patients in the US and millions around the world.
Using technologies like 5G networks and robotic systems to provide cardiac care at a distance and be able to do telestenting has the potential to change the landscape of medicine. 5G technology really opens up the possibility to do these over longer distances with minimal delays in signal and transmitting greater amounts of data.
Being able to reach a patient hundreds of miles away to deliver the care they need when they need it is one of the most disruptive things happening in the medical industry.
Little video, this convergence of technologies. The reason why I put that in is because from a longevity perspective, 143 million people every year are affected because they have no access to primary surgical facilities. So all of a sudden, that means that if you've had a heart attack and you're in the middle of the desert, and the consultant is in New York, that New York consultant, provided you have the right technologies in the right places, can operate on you in the middle of the Sahel. And then when we talk about virtual reality, increasingly we get rid of the headsets because we have virtual reality glasses, courtesy of organizations basically like Panasonic, HTC, as well as Harvard and Meta. So these are virtual reality glasses. So if we suddenly want to get into a virtual reality workspace, I put on some glasses. The artificial intelligence knows where my hands are and everything else because we're using machine vision. So one of the laws of technology is we have all these science fiction things, but in terms of the actual when do these things become usable? When do we adopt them? When do they become the mainstay? That's down to the technology becoming invisible and convenient. Because if you can step into your virtual office just by putting glasses on and then you're out, and if these are cheaper than a laptop, I argue with organizations like KPMG and everything else, at what point do you no longer provide your employees with a laptop? Now, you can also work with anyone. So when we have a look at things like Microsoft Mesh, for example, we can digitize physical human presence. So if I'm on the stage here, increasingly, and I have a colleague in Australia, I can increasingly use these technologies and walk around the stage while I'm also walking around the stage or next to my colleague who is in Australia. So digitizing physical human presence
connection
brings that
is a
collaboration
spark
element
that gives
back
our
in
lives meaning.
that we generally lose with teleconferencing.
It drives us to seek out others who feel the same way.
Okay, why don't you input the data and we'll take a look together. Hey Mari, what you got for me?
To find those who share our views, yet offer different perspectives.
そうですね。
over here.
challenge us with new ways of seeing,
That I think we should...
deepen our understanding, and enrich our lives.
最后一笔的时候，往前。
Great things happen when we commit to something bigger than ourselves.
Let's take a closer look at it.
Place this here. Let's see how we go from there, okay?
This sense of collaboration and the feelings of connection it brings excites us.
Hey, just in time. I'm gonna move it slightly, okay?
It's yours, take it.
We have 2 planes right now on the same trajectory.
As we put people first, technology fades into the background and feels like anything but.
Aisha, what do you think?
I think if we had 330, maintaining 2800,
We'll be clear for approach.
Excellent.
This changes the way we see the world, and in turn, changes the world we see.
These numbers are looking great, actually.
There's promise in the possibilities, and what we see and create next will stretch the imagination.
Good morning, Sarah.
Morning.
Slowly coming towards the thumb.
A world without boundaries.
Good job. A lot better than yesterday.
Yeah.
Excellent. Slowly bring
A
the
world
arm
where
down.
technology enhances, not limits, humanity. With people front, center, and in the spotlight. The future is here. And here can be anywhere. Introducing
All these
Microsoft
different
Mesh.
technologies are changing what we do, where we work, who we work with, which then fundamentally changes the kinds of companies that I work for, the pensions that I invest in, and the pension schemes that I or my organizations have. And then we can also work with anything.
Today, we're all being disrupted. And I'm not just talking about by digital humans like myself with our conversational artificial intelligence, state-of-the-art high-def rendering, and neural networks for brains.
This is Anna. She is my digital human employee. Now, when I had my first conversations with Alan and Overy basically about the future of work, we said, increasingly, we will see the rise of digital humans. Then we will see people who are cloning themselves in digital form. These artificial intelligences who are then accumulating the expertise of these individuals because it can read all their data, their information, et cetera, et cetera. And then all of a sudden, I can be doing a presentation here or whatever it happens to be, but the virtual version of myself can still be advising lots of other people around the world. Now, at that point, A&O sort of said, interesting. It was interesting to see the younger generations were like, actually, yeah, I could see a point basically where the real me is here, but the virtual me, the digital human version of me, is advising clients basically somewhere else on the planet. Bearing in mind, you can scale these up to millions. And increasingly, so Anna, basically about sort of 2 to 3 years ago, was nowhere near photorealistic. Now they are going beyond photorealism. Then finally, basically we have augmented, the Centaur principle. The Centaur principle was put together originally by the people who were beaten by artificial intelligence. So like Garry Kasparov, the chess grandmaster, and Sudong Liu, the Go champion. People said, so you were an expert in your field and you were comprehensively beaten by artificial intelligence. When we have a look at Dentons basically are increasingly using robot-based lawyers. So they are increasingly reducing the number of paralegals that they're actually hiring, because increasingly artificial intelligence is now doing the work of the paralegals, and but also augmenting them. Now, with the Go champion, he said, yeah, when AI beat me, I'd practiced all my life to be the best at this particular field, and it trashed me, and so I'm going to retire. The press went back to him about 3 months later and said, so, have you actually had a think, what are you doing in retirement? And he said, actually, I realized at the time that artificial intelligence actually made me a better player, because I played like a human. The AI played in a fundamentally different way, and it made this move called Move 37, which everybody thought was the biggest mistake of every game this thing had played. And that was the masterstroke. And he said, because the artificial intelligence played in a different way, a non-human way, it showed me a new strategy. And so now I have my human skills, but I now have the skills of the artificial intelligence, and I'm now even better than I was before. So when you start combining people, augmenting people with artificial intelligence, we end up with this kind of concept. When we have a look at Google, has Google actually harmed you or benefited you? If I asked you what the melting point of iron was, you can find out in 2 seconds. So Google democratized access to information. Artificial intelligence is increasingly democratizing access to skills. So for example, when we have a look at companies like Dentons, if we have a an artificial intelligence-based robo-lawyer, you can now ask it and say, I have this particular case, I'm looking for information. Can you actually have a look in all the records and everything else, basically to find precedent of X, Y, and Z? And the AI, because it's really good at this big data problem, will come back and say, well, actually, I found this. But also, when we have a look at things like artificial intelligence, by putting a new behavioral interface over the top of them that lets us talk to them, suddenly what you have is you now have verbal access to all the world's information, or all the information in your company. So does that make you a worse lawyer? Or does that make you a better one that's more productive?
Hey, Watson, I have a question for you.
Sure.
How are you different than artificial intelligence?
I share some elements with artificial intelligence, but there are key differences.
Like what?
I'm working to help people think better and make more informed decisions. Cognitive computing is about augmenting human intelligence, not replacing it.
So you're not trying to think for me?
No.
What's my favorite color?
I have no idea.
Favorite food?
Nope.
Do I prefer cats or dogs?
Cats?
Wrong. Neither. Trick question, Watson.
So what happens when you combine the best of humans, which is often sort of creative, slightly messy, slightly random, with the best of artificial intelligence that is fantastic at mining through huge volumes of exascale data to find and identify patterns and useful information? Personally, while we can automate people using these technologies, I think the synergies show that we're actually much better together. Now, when we have a look at longevity, what would you do with your lives? And I asked this to the Willis Towers Watson crew. I've asked this to them a number of times. What would you do with your life if we had the technology to extend your life by 30 years or more? Would you recycle more? If you're the CEO of a highly polluting company, would you suddenly care about the planet because you're actually going to see the sea level rising, the Category 6 hurricanes coming through? But this is the reality that we now face. So when we have a look at, for example, the World Health Organization, when we have a look at things like mortality, we've got cardiovascular diseases at the top, cancers, respiratory diseases, digestive diseases. Overall, we have tens of millions of people who are dying from all kinds of different things. Okay? However, what I sort of found most interesting, basically, when I sort of sift through this data, is over the past sort of 30 years, the number of people dying through accidents has stayed the same, pretty much, whether it's industrial accidents or car accidents and that kind of stuff. However, when you have a look at the difference between communicable diseases, like viruses, and this doesn't include COVID-19, I'm going to say that, we've moved from 44% of people dying because of bacteria and viruses to 26%. But when we look at non-communicable diseases, or when we look at non-communicable, easy for me to say, causes of deaths, it's gone from 46 to 64. So during this presentation, I could quite easily have just trotted out a load of healthcare stuff, okay? But let's start moving the dial. Now, when we have a look at the risk factors, disease, bacteria and viruses basically still account for about 17 million deaths a year, excluding COVID, obviously. Blood pressure and sugar, so things like diabetes, high blood pressure and everything else, actually kill the same number of people every year. Dietary, so either lack of access to food or eating the wrong foods, processed foods, all that kind of stuff, kills 9 million people. Pollution, air and water pollution, so air pollution kills 8 million people a year, water pollution kills 1 million people a year, Smoking, 8 million people a year. Heat, 5 million people a year. That's upticking. That's it. So, for example, one of the leading causes of death, especially in cities across Europe now, is actually heat. Accidents still kill 1 million. Mental health via suicide, depression, all that kind of stuff basically kill 1 million as well. So this is how we actually start moving the dial on all of these different risk factors. So for example, with accidents, over the next 20 years, we will be increasingly rolling out fully autonomous vehicles. We're at category 3 at the moment. A category 3 self-driving car, the likes especially that we see from Mercedes, Google, Toyota, all the usual sort of suspects, we've seen over a 99% reduction in accidents. Have a conversation with RSA, with Aviva, with AXA, all these kinds of organizations. Self-driving cars are not perfect, but they kill a lot less people than human drivers do. So all of a sudden, this kind of technology now saves 1.2 million people. Even if you put it conservatively, we reduce the number of accidents by, say, 90% or whatever it happens to be. You've still got 1 million more people coming through that are surviving because they didn't get hit by a car. When we have a look at non-communicable diseases, so, for example, we can make food from air. We can make protein from air. It's a NASA technology. So we take bacteria, we combine them with CO2, electricity, and we create protein and soy. We can do this anywhere. You can literally do this in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. You can do this in the Antarctic. So all of a sudden, basically, we have a way to feed people high-quality protein without actually hurting the planet as well. Now, when we have a look at moves in agriculture, this has a potential to save over 9 million lives. As I mentioned earlier, we have bioreactors. You take a single cell from an animal, put it into a bioreactor, it divides, and ultimately grows new flesh. So we do what happens inside of an animal, outside of an animal. Now, in this particular case, this means that we can produce meat, genuine meat, not plant, not insect, etc., 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 without the animal. And it could be any animal. It can be tuna, salmon, octopus, panda, zebra, all that kind of stuff. When we start having a look at crops, we're seeing generally about 40% of global crop production being destroyed by extreme weather. That has an impact on people's health. If people can't eat properly, then they are iller. If they are iller, then they tend to die sooner. So we can grow crops indoors, vertical farms. I was with City yesterday, basically, and they sort of went to a vertical farm that was down in one of the tube tunnels. So we no longer have to import lettuce and kale and all these other crops basically from abroad. We can just grow them in the building next door, or we could grow them upstairs. So what we now have is food security. But this is all organic, no pesticides, no herbicides, 8 times the yield, 350 times less footprint, uses a lot less water. This is a vertical farm. This is not your traditional, I have a field and I grow crops where half my crops get destroyed and flooded. This is guaranteed food supply. You can stand these up anywhere. And Jeff Bezos, Walmart, Ocado, they are all starting to do this. Guaranteed organic food at prices the supermarkets cannot beat. And they received $250 million from Jeff Bezos to put a vertical farm outside every single city with 1 million people. We can 3D print food. This is 3D printed fruit. Now, Nestle are 3D printing food that is personalized to your specific genome. It's a multi-billion-dollar business now. So rather than just creating generic food that's processed or whatever it happens to be, I can 3D print a food that is tailored to your exclusive dietary requirements. So again, improves health. And if you improve health, you reduce disease and death. When we have a look at things like air pollution, the electrification of industry saves 6.7 million people. So we're electrifying commercial and residential buildings. We're putting solar panels on the top of these buildings, for example. So we no longer need to have power plants basically that kick out fossil fuels. We are turning industry and heavy industry green. We're electrifying transport. Now, if you imagine basically the smog over Los Angeles, how many people did that kill? When you go to Delhi, basically you taste the air. So again, air pollution kills 6.7 million people a year. But by electrifying industries, which is a long task, don't get me wrong, we reduce that. Last year, we installed 250 gigawatts of renewable energy versus 65 gigawatts for fossil fuels. This is an increasing trend. Fossil fuels are going away. And then when we have a look at the energy mix, there are huge numbers of new energy technologies actually coming through, which means that the last thing that we need is going to be fossil fuels. So the energy transition alone, as I mentioned earlier, is going to cost $92 trillion, but we're investing $2 trillion a year, generally. When we have a look at things like extreme heat, we had a summer basically where we broke all of the records. Most of Europe was baking at 40 degrees Celsius. In Europe alone, basically, we have seen a significant increase in the number of deaths because people are just too hot. So in Miami, we now have chief heat officers. This is the first appointment in the world. Basically, a chief heat officer is responsible for trying to find ways to cool Miami down. And we do that by greening the cities, by building the cities in different ways, by using different kinds of concrete and so on and so forth. So when we have a look at extreme heat, there is now this acceptance that as our cities get hotter, we need to fundamentally reinvent them. And we need to try to cool them down best we can. Now, when we have a look at things like mental health, 1 million people basically commit suicide every year, at least. The pandemic, and I work with a lot of mental health charities, now mean that 1 in 6 people have a mental health issue of some form. So when we start talking about going back to work, how many of you, now that you're sort of going back into the office, how many of you or how many of your companies have gone, you know what, take a mental health day, take a mental health week? We collectively, as the human race, basically have been through a pandemic that has killed tens of millions of people. That is a huge mental burden. So at what point have you thought about yourself?
What do you feel when you say the word I?
Make a choice. Like, you just decide what it's going to be, who you're going to be, how you're going to do it. Just decide. And then from that point, the universe is going to get out your way. It's like it's water. It wants to move and go around stuff,
If you decide to drop your buckets where you are and develop your gifts, I grant you, you'll never, ever be without. I grant you that your gifts will take you places that will literally amaze you. So decide that you're going to take some time to work on you, that you deserve that from yourself, that your life deserves some prime time, because you are creating your own production. You are the star of your show. You are the director. You're writing the script. And you will determine whether your life is a smash office hit or flop.
I'm going to work. I'm going to press forward. I'm going to learn. I'm going to do everything in my power. Every single day, I'm going to do everything in my power to become a victor and not a victim. Winners win and losers lose.
It's better to be prepared for an opportunity and not have one than to have an opportunity and not be prepared.
At what point have you taken a break yourselves? Just because you need to. Now, when we have a look at technologies, we have the rise of telepsychiatry. So Facebook, for example, monitors the angle with which you hold your phone. Because if you are depressed, you pick your phone up slower. You scroll slower. The words that you use are different to when you're happy, and so on and so forth. So increasingly, we have a huge variety of different ways that we can use these things to establish your mental health. And then with telepsychiatrists like Wobot, they can send you a notification saying, I think you're a little bit upset today. What's up? So telepsychiatry as well as telehealth basically is a thing. We also see memory editing. So for example, basically with people who are actually addicted, we can use a technology called optogenetics. We've proven this. We can literally make them forget they were addicted, let alone all manner of other things. So when we actually have a look at the mental health sphere, there's a lot to unpack, but these are sort of some of the more impactful ones, I will say. Then when we have a look at communicable deaths, so this is how we save the other 17 million people. So 2028 is a year basically which we reach something called escape velocity. When you have a conversation with pharmaceutical organizations and biotech organizations, 2028 is the year that they believe that new healthcare breakthroughs will mean that we can add more than 1 year's worth of life to you for every year that you live. And here are some of these examples. So for example, we have predictive and quantified healthcare, or quantified healthcare, easy for me to say. So this is things like wearables. We all know basically that wearables will detect your pulse. They can tell basically when your heartbeat is irregular. Now, rather than waiting for you to have a heart attack, predictive healthcare, which is generally driven by artificial intelligence, can say, we detect an irregular heartbeat. We think you should go and have a conversation with your doctor now. You go and have a conversation with your doctor now, and your doctor says, you are quite right to come to me now, because actually we can make some interventions in your diet, your lifestyle, whatever it happens to be. Now, on the one hand, that means that you are less likely to have the heart attack in the first place. And as they say, it's not the first heart attack that kills you, it's the second. But if you do have a heart attack, then we can use stem cell technology to repair the damaged tissue to your heart. So when we have a look at things like quantified self and predictive healthcare, basically which organizations like Vitality are a big fan of, et cetera, this is where we can literally predict your health. Now, telehealth as well. This isn't a smartphone. This is a tricorder, because I can use artificial intelligence in the camera and I can look like I'm taking a selfie, but it's diagnosing whether or not I have pancreatic cancer. Because when I have pancreatic cancer, my eyes are slightly yellowy. The camera can tell what my blood pressure is, what my heart rate is. It can tell me if I've got skin cancer. The accelerometers in these phones, if I do this, it can measure my heartbeat, tell me whether I'm going to have a heart attack. When I use the microphone in these things and I talk, they can determine whether I'm an idiot futurist or whether I have dementia. Because when you have dementia, you talk differently. When you have PTSD, as it turns out, you end up being quite monotone. So just by using the microphone, we can listen to vocal biomarkers. Caltech managed to establish whether or not people had COVID because they could listen to changes in your voice. When you sort of get a cough and you get ill, your voice changes. These are tricorders. Now, by putting all these different capabilities into a smartphone, I unlock access to secondary healthcare and on-demand healthcare to over 1 billion people who today don't have access to regular doctors and so on and so forth. Now, in addition to this, there was one of Google's artificial intelligences managed to crack the 50-year grand challenge of biology. And these are just the highlights, basically, of healthcare. DeepFold has managed to simulate every single known protein on the planet and then put it into an open source database. Now, for any of you that know healthcare, if you can figure out what the protein structure is, you can create drugs and treatments for that. This is now an instant task. It used to take people decades to try to figure out the protein structure of particular things, even COVID. But now that we actually have these technologies, for example, when we have a look at next-gen vaccines, we can make a vaccine in 7 minutes, courtesy of artificial intelligence, Google DeepMind's DeepFold artificial intelligence. We also have vaccines for cancer out of both the US as well as China. And so these genetically engineered cancer vaccines have actually been proven to turn back even category 3 cancers. So we make things there. Now, when we have a look at distribution of vaccines, we had a massive problem when it came to distributing vaccines, obviously. We've got aerosols. We've even got bioengineered plants. So the FDA, there was a company that grew plants that had vaccines in them. So you ate the fruit and you were automatically vaccinated. So you can imagine the regulators having a chat about that one. So we can bioengineer plants basically to contain vaccines. We've got chewing gum. So if you don't want to be needled, if COVID comes back or when it comes back or whatever it happens to be, you can just put a load of chewing gum in the post to everybody. mRNA vaccines, which is sort of the big win that we saw. Plasters, if you don't like vaccines, basically we can put them in a plaster. So when we start talking about vaccines, it's one thing to produce the vaccines, but it's another thing to actually get them distributed to, say, 7 billion people. But we're solving cold chains and all kinds of different things. Now, we also have artificial intelligences, courtesy of organizations like MIT, that have invented brand new antibiotics. So we have a massive antibiotic crisis. In fact, the World Health Organization says that the antibiotic crisis is the next big health crisis. Now, we've got genetic engineering technologies like CRISPR. So CRISPR is a chainsaw. It finds a way to get into different bacteria and everything else, and it literally rips them apart from the inside out by editing their DNA. Phage therapy, which is where we use big viruses to go and eat antibiotic-resistant bacteria. We've got new polymers, but we've also got synthetic molecules. So when we start talking about the antibiotic crisis, we actually have quite a lot of interesting things coming through. Then a company out of Australia, a company called In Silico, their artificial intelligence designed 30,000 new drugs in 21 days. So the future accelerates. But what happens basically when we start combining human researchers with artificial intelligence, and AIs can create cures to diseases in next to no time. But it's all very well producing these treatments. We need to test them. One of the biggest problems that we had with COVID is it actually took 3 months to produce the vaccine. Bear in mind, it used to take 5 to 10 years. But it took about 3 to 6 months to test it. So on the one hand, basically, we've got human on a chip. So what we do is we simulate human organs on these little plastic chips. So if I want to test whether or not a new heart drug actually works on the human heart, I don't use a human, I use this. And it costs about 90 cents. And I know instantly whether or not it's working. But in America, we're actually going one further. We take all of your data and we digitize you. So we create a digital copy of you as an individual at the cellular level, which now means that, for example, with opioids, if we're not sure what dose you should have, we can run a simulation on your digital twin and say, we gave your digital twin this amount of opioid and actually killed you, sorry, and you drop it. So increasingly, we are digitizing the clinical trial process, which again accelerates the rate at which new drugs are created and the speed at which they get into the market. Gene sequencing. As a futurist, everyone's always gone, eventually gene sequencing will be real time and cost $100. 3 months ago, we managed to sequence the entire human genome in 5 hours for less than $1,000. This opens up personalized medicine like crazy. We have in vivo gene editing. We have people who generally have 6,000 incurable diseases today. And we had a patient with Hunter's syndrome. And Hunter's syndrome, the good news is you die in 20 years. The bad news is you die really painfully in 20 years. Incurable. But what we did is we stuck patient X in a bed, put them on an intravenous drip, fed CRISPR into their blood. The genetic engineering tool found the bad gene, clipped it out, clipped in the good gene. Patient no longer has Hunter's syndrome. CRISPR, as an individual technology, solves the problem of how you cure over 6,000 inherited genetic conditions. It also leads to designer humans. So when you're actually starting to create, for example, health insurance and life insurance policies, from a legal perspective, how many of you even think about putting, have you been genetically altered? Because even the IOC is now looking for genetically altered Olympians. 3D printed medicines. If I get ill and I go to the doctor, say amoxicillin, got toothache, you get the same dose as me. But if I'm an 8-foot tall rugby player and you're a 4-foot tall little old lady, for example, it doesn't make sense. So we've got the University of Glasgow as well as the NHS that are now able to 3D print medicines, but those 3D printed medicines contain only the things that you need that are right for your body type, etc., etc., etc. Universal organ donors, we have found a way to create universal organs. We started with livers because hundreds of thousands of people die because they can't get an organ transplant. And then when we start talking about 3D printed organs, which you're probably mostly familiar with, we can already 3D print bone, corneas, muscle, cartilage, and all kinds of other things. But in 10 years' time, the researchers behind this last slide estimate that this thing will be able to be commercialized. And what it is the world's first 3D printed human heart. Now imagine that you have a heart attack in 2035, 2040. You go into the NHS. Firstly, they've done something wrong because you've had the heart attack. That's it. But you go into Guy's and St. Tommy's, they 3D print you off a human heart. But your human heart from your pluripotent stem cells, there's no rejection.
This is the first time that the whole cellular heart with blood vessel is printed.
So it's mini, but all technology starts off looking lame, and then it gets bigger and bigger. But this is
It's based on a small biopsy that is taken from a patient. The cells and the biomaterial from this tissue are separated. The cells are reprogrammed to become stem cells and then differentiated to become cardiac cells and cells that form blood vessels. And the biomaterial, the collagen and other sugars that in the tissue is processed to become a bioink. And together, when mixed, we have bioinks for the heart and bioinks for the blood vessels. And then we use a 3D printer to print whole hearts with the major blood vessels.
I'm not sure it's going to serve ourselves in the next few years, but for our children, I think it's going to be maybe an amazing opportunity.
The whole process may take months or two from the minute that we take the biopsy from the patient till we create the cells and print them. And the next stage is to mature these hearts in the lab for at least a month to help the cells or teach them how to interact with each other, how to provide electrical signal and to have a synchronous contraction or pumping ability of the heart. And in a year or two, we hope to take these hearts and transplant them in small animal models in rats or rabbits.
It will take some time to go from a small size heart into an entire big heart. We still have a long way to go, but we are very optimistic.
So when we kind of take the short, medium, longer term view, at what point do the people basically that you are actually providing goods and services for and everything else start living beyond 100 years? Because today we are laying the foundations, whether it is fully autonomous vehicles, whether it is the future of food, whether it is the future of healthcare, to extend human wellness and therefore extend human life. And that's it from me. So I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you very much for listening.